Hello everybody, my name is Christina. Welcome to this video and welcome to this channel. On this channel, I talk about how to create comics. I've been working on my own comic for over 10 years, so I'm sharing everything I've learned after doing just that. In today's video, we're gonna talk about a little bit of a more complicated topic, which is writing trauma. I'm not gonna lie, this video was extremely difficult to film. In fact, I was torn between making this as more like a podcast and giving you some sort of a B-roll as I'm talking to the mic only, or showing my face. I wish I was exaggerating, but I tried to make this video about 4 times. This is my 5th attempt, which is crazy considering how long this video is going to be. The reason is it's a very complicated topic and I wanted to do it justice and at the same time being able to summarize everything that I want to say so it makes sense. Because as you will see, simplification and structuring of the topic is really something that will help us to apply it in our writing, in our comics, in our novels, and whatnot. So it was very difficult to film, but it's finally happening. So I hope you enjoy it. Also, if you like what I'm seeing, if you like this channel, please subscribe or click the like button. Just clicking the like button or dropping in the comment really helps the channel to grow because this is how YouTube understands that people resonate with this. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the topic. And there are 2 things that I want to talk about before we go into nitty-gritty. First one being why this topic, like why I want to talk about this topic in particular. And the reason being is that this topic is extremely interesting to me personally for multiple reasons. First is that I have my own personal interest in psychology, and I've been always fascinated with the way our brain works, how it processes some difficult experiences, and then how it tries to heal us from that, how it gets hurt, and how it sometimes tries to even hide the injury to itself from us. I don't know, I always thought that it's extremely fascinating how we are such complex intellectual beings, but at the same time we have very animalistic urges and needs and how it all kind of works together or doesn't. It's also interesting to me to see how we act as people under stress or major distress, how we act in the dangerous situations and how we change our perspectives. Like, I don't know, human psyche is extremely, extremely interesting. And I've been interested in it since I was very young. I remember like being a little kid and noticing certain discrepancies with what I would be seeing in the world and how people behave, what's happening. And I would be so curious as of why are we so messy, really? Because logically, we know what is the best approach for a lot of things. If we apply science, we get even more information, but it's not enough for humans. There is a lot of personal things that get in the way. There are a lot of perspective that can really tweak how people view the same situation from different angles. Anyway, I was always very curious. I've been learning as much as I could about psychology myself. I've been experimenting on myself, and it just happened to be that I've been surrounded by therapists, psychiatrists, and psychologists all my life. And I don't know, I got a lot of nerdy conversations with them, and I've always enjoyed the topic. So this is the first reason why I really want to talk about it. The second one is that in my story, I have a character who actually experienced a very, very severe trauma. And from the beginning, I understood that if I want to do this character justice, I need to understand how to write the trauma into the story correctly and with care. And it's really because I knew that the trauma is so severe that happened in characters' past, there is no way the character that we meet in the present will not be majorly affected by this trauma. This character's decisions and actions should be very much still be driven by this trauma to a high percentage just because they haven't processed this trauma yet. And with this character, it was very obvious. The trauma they experienced was very clear. It was obviously traumatic, extremely traumatic, especially because I write fantasy and my story has magical elements. So the traumatic experience that character went through, well, it's not possible to experience something like this in our human life. So it's also like more extreme because of the magical factors involved. I knew that I need to implement it into the story. So that's why I also try to understand how to do it right, how to do it effectively from the point of presenting it right, but also implementing it into the plot. So it is interesting to observe. and making it a true part of the plot. I wanted to make sure everything is integrated and connected. So because of this, I need to figure it out. And I put a lot of my mental energy into this. And eventually, after figuring out this character for a very long time, I realized that tools and things that I learned while developing this character can be actually applicable to other characters in my story, even the ones that didn't experience severe trauma. And if we look at the characters, they all have something that altered the way they think. They all have something in their past that they need to reconcile with. It doesn't have to be something catastrophic. It can be something minor. It can be some internal conflict. So first, I realized, hey, I can apply the same logic, everything that I've learned with this character to other characters in my story. But then the more I started to think, I started to pay attention to how other stories are structured. And I quickly realized that a lot of contemporary stories are actually about reconciling trauma. And when I say trauma, again, I don't mean something extremely, extremely catastrophic. It could be something minor as well, something that affected us enough to change our perspective about ourselves, about the world. And this perspective is caused to be changed by the trauma, and it drives the character forward. And in the end, doing character a disservice. So character ultimately has to overcome it to resolve the external conflict of the story. So I realized that this is what the more recent stories are about. And even if you look at the story structures and all the writing advice and plotting advices that are going around, they all have this element of internal conflict of the character that almost parallel to external conflict. And in fact, resolving of the internal conflict is usually something that acts as a catalyst for character being finally able to overcome external conflict. That made me wonder, isn't like, why is it happening? Why we're actually writing about resolving our internal conflicts, our personal small or big traumas. And as we look at the stories that have been written earlier, especially like older classics, they didn't really have it. In fact, we didn't really have understanding about the character's internal world. We could understand that the character is like angry or upset or disturbed or stressed out, usually because we were told that. But we never got a glimpse of the character from the inside and understand kind of anatomy of everything they're going through. And I think it is because psychology as a science is really recent. I think it was established and acknowledged as a science in 19th century. So that explains that now we have this additional information about the world and how it works, and we implement it in our stories. When I think about stories, I believe that the purpose of stories is to understand the world and pass on the wisdom about what does it mean to have an experience of being a human? What does it mean to live? What does it mean to live a good, satisfying life? And what decisions to make in certain difficult situations. If we look at very old stories like myths, legends, fairy tales, they all have this wisdom, of course, colored by the time they've been written in, or if they were not written, like when they were created and passed on. They all try to tell you what you're supposed to do to be happy, or what you're not supposed to do to be happy, or how does evil look like so you can recognize it, or how goodness looks like so you can recognize it as well. What you should do to do good and what you shouldn't do in order not to do bad. So I believe that all stories are inherently about how to live, what is life, and how to enjoy it and how to not suffer. And they're all kind of like this recipe of everything that we're learning and understanding at the moment. Of course, they change as society changes, but I truly believe like this is the true purpose of the stories. And to me, it makes sense now that now with new context about how the world is, we write different stories. They are way more psychological. They way more about characters' internal worlds. And I think it is very interesting. And I think we need to understand how to do it well and just understand also how to implement it into a narrative. So that's the reason why I'm so curious about this topic. It's extremely relevant to me. I'm also very curious about it. And I think it's extremely relevant to the way we write stories now. So that's why I wanted to record a very long video on this topic. And even though 4 times I couldn't, I still persist because I think it is an important topic. Now, before I truly dive in, it's time for a disclaimer. I think it's self-explanatory why I have to do a disclaimer. It is a very specific topic, and I need to tell you, however interested I am in the topic, however much I like it, doesn't matter. I'm not a psychologist, not psychiatrist. I'm not in any way mental health professional. I don't have education or license to talk about this topic in the context of helping you overcome certain mental health struggles. This is not at all a point of this video, and this is not what I'm talking about. The point of this video is to talk about how to create imaginary characters in the imaginary world, having imaginary traumas, and how to write these stories to the degree that it looks realistic and it communicates exactly what we want to communicate. So we have good control of what we create and how does it move the story forward and what is the message of our story is. So the purpose of this video is truly talk just about writing, about people who are imaginary and not real. I needed to make sure this is out of the way, and please consider also this video as a discussion rather than me telling you this is exactly how you're supposed to do it. I don't know. This is how I do it, and this is how it works for me. And I think certain things that I came up with are pretty decent, but ultimately I'm just a drop in the ocean of the conversation about how to write. If you have different methods of how you approach writing trauma, please leave them in the comments down below. Let's discuss, let's talk. I want to hear what you're doing and how you're doing this. So please consider this video as a discussion. If it works for you, fantastic. This is exactly why I'm recording this. If it does not, very fair. Don't worry about this. Maybe listen because you're just curious. Now that we're clear about this, let's dive in and let me tell you the structure of how I want to approach discussing this topic. So the first thing I would like to talk about is the anatomy of trauma itself, kind of trying to understand how trauma happens, what happens in the moment of trauma, what happens later. Basically, what are the emotions of why it happens, how does it work, how our soul psyche try to reconcile the trauma, basically the standard procedures of the trauma. Was it for? How does it work? How does it affect a person in a general level, kind of understanding the basics of it. And then we're going to talk about how you can implement it into your character, into their arc, into the plot, and into their journey, and even into the themes of your story. So that is the structure that we're going to follow. So first, let's talk about the anatomy of trauma, how trauma occurs, all the processes, all of that. This is at least how I understand it. Obviously, it is an extremely complicated topic, and this is the part of the video that I've been struggling with the most, just because there is so much information and so much nuance in this particular part that it was very difficult for me to narrow down. So I'm going to try again to narrow it down and make it coherent. When we're talking about the moment of trauma occurring, first, there are kind of two blocks of how I want to approach it, and each blocks kind of have their own structure. The first block is our internal responses to trauma. First, we have our emotional response, and then we have our logical response, or you might call it our ego response, survival brain response, more of like cold-blooded, logical part of our brain. And as I said, there is also emotional one. So there are two of our types of responses that we're going to talk about. But then there's also timeline of trauma. So there is a moment in time when a trauma occurs, certain processes happen during this time. Then there is a moment right after trauma, how we're trying to comprehend the trauma and kind of place it in our brain, this experience, try to absorb it. And then there is a timeline after trauma, the moment of how the trauma has altered us and how we are now forever changed moving forward. And I apologize if I'm going to say we, them as characters interchangeably. And if it's going to be a little confusing, I'm really sorry. It's a little confusing in our brain, because in my brain, when I talk about my characters, when I write them, I relive the story with them. So at some point when I think about trauma, it's all messy in my brain in a sense of who is experiencing. So please forgive me, it's getting a little bit confusing if I use these two interchangeably, like we, us, me, them. I'm sorry. Whoever, whichever pronouns or, noun appears here, all of these people experience a trauma. I'm really sorry. All of these examples that are all over the place. And by the way, if you're wondering why you have happy playing children on your background from your comic, is it some sort of a sick and twisted foreshadowing for your own story? And the answer is, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Shit is gonna go down so bad for these guys, like in approximately 40 minutes. So if you know, you know. If you're reading my story, if you're super up to date, you might already start having the creeps. So I just put it out there for eye candy, but if you know, you know, just saying. Talking about two responses that we have. First, let's talk about emotions and emotional responses. And emotions on their own can be a whole completely different independent topic because they're so fascinating. And I think we as society just starting to understand what emotions truly are, what to do with them, how to deal with them, what is the purpose of emotion is. I kid you not. I realized the other day, like the other month, okay, that I'm not sure. I was never told growing up what's the point of emotions, We understand the point of our hands, our feet. We understand the point of pain, physical pain. We understand the meaning of this. We know that it's there to alert us to something bad going on so we can help ourselves. If our legs hurt, maybe don't walk, like wait for a second. There's information there. And I realized that I never was taught growing up or like ever, what's the point of emotions? The majority of information that I received about my emotions that I need to keep chill and try to not let them muddle the waters in front of me. It's almost like the message that I got that emotions could be a problem and you need to rein them in and you need to control them because if you don't, it can be a problem. This is the message I received from just existing in the world, which is interesting. Let me know what was your experience. But I honestly, being 30 years old, just started trying to figure out what emotions are for and what we're supposed to do with them because nobody told me and I didn't come into this world with instructions. And I actually went ahead and Googled and then I asked ChatGPT about this because I just was curious, what is the information officially out there? And the best I found is that emotions are preparing us for action. So if you are walking in the forest, you hear weird sound, you get scared. This emotions of fear tells you that maybe you should be getting ready to run. Or maybe if you're being attacked, you might experience emotion of anger, and this emotion kind of communicates to maybe you should get ready to fight, and your body starts having very real physical responses preparing you for the fight. That makes sense, but it doesn't explain a lot of nuanced emotions. This is where I'm going to give you my own opinion, how I interpreted emotions at this point in my life, and how I think they are working in the moment of trauma. So, how I see emotions is that they are telling us something important about the situation that we're in as it relates to us. It could be as straightforward as, again, you're walking in the woods, you hear a sound, your emotions are telling you, I'm scared, this is scary, and this is important information. In this surrounding, in relations to you, you feel fear. The idea is your emotions are telling you that this, for you, is maybe something that you should run away from, for example. So you run away, you get a clue from your emotions and you follow this. The same, you can get the same fear if, let's say, you're talking to a person and they're speaking in a certain way that start making you feel fear, which again, your emotions can communicate to you. This person, as it relates to you, is not safe. This person makes you feel fear. You probably need to take action, get information from the emotion and yeet it out. Don't talk to this person anymore. Maybe try to avoid being with this person alone in the place. I don't know. It can be something as you interact with a friend and at some point you feel hurt by the way this friend behaves. The information that you're getting is that the way this friend behaves is hurtful for me. This behavior is hurtful. This is information that you can later use to communicate it to a friend to say, hey, listen, I don't like this behavior. And from there, depending on how they react, you can make your own decisions. But the idea is emotions are telling you your match or mismatch with the environment around you as it applies to you. It's almost like you're a fish in the water and your emotions can tell you, is this water salty when you need fresh water, or is it water too hot when you need colder water to survive? They're telling you about the environment, but it is also subjective to you. So they're telling you some important information, but it's only correct information for you. It's in your own language for yourself as a person. So this is how I interpret emotions, and how I see emotions is that once they come in, you just have to let them through. You just have to feel them, get the memo, and then you act. And emotions are kind of like physical pain. They're letting you know that there's something wrong, and they're going to let you know and continue letting you know that something is wrong as long as something is wrong. So, for example, if there is a serious injury that you experience, you will feel the pain until the injury is being healed or will be tended to the degree that you continue healing and it's not a problem right now. For example, you got bandages or you got a cast on, something like this, then your pain slowly starts subsiding, communicating to you, okay, that's not an emergency that we need to tend to, it's fine. And for example, if you hit your elbow, well, it's not an injury, but it's hella painful. And we all know by hitting our elbows, I'm sure everybody done it at least once, is that once you hit your elbow, you feel this pain and it has to just play out. You just have to feel it till the end. It will play out and then you will be okay, but it's just this ringing that you have to feel. I feel like emotions are the same. You have to feel them through or feel them and adjust the situation that is going on, and only then let them go away as a result of you addressing the problem versus just trying to ignore the emotions. I think the ignoring in the emotions is just like ignoring a pain signal, ignoring the physical pain that you have, and you're not able to do anything. So this is how I view emotions. And now let's talk about how I see they relate to trauma. Traumatic experience. Let's have an example, and I will be using like a fantasy themed example for this video. Let's talk about a minstrel. We have a character who is a minstrel, and when she was, let's say, 7 years old, she was traveling with her family, with her fellow minstrels in a caravan through the forest at night, and they were attacked by bandits. Everybody got murdered but her. So this is the traumatic experience we will use, and like a small example right here. So what happens in the moment of trauma? Emotions that the character experiences, and let's call her Lilith. And poor Lilith experienced this crazy situation, and while she was experiencing, I betcha she was feeling a lot of emotions that were telling her on all fronts, all of this is wrong, all of this is bad, terrible. You have to run away. You have to maybe even fight back. You have to basically avoid the situation. This situation is a no-no for you. Don't like it for you, not good. And because the situation was so extreme and there were a lot of things happening at the same time, the attack, potentially she could be injured, and she sees her loved ones getting murdered. It's like there's a lot of things that are giving her a signal that it's a bad, not good situation. Because of this, let's say Lilith is hearing and feeling all these emotions. They're very, very strong. So this is what happened in the emotional situation at this time. They're very strong, very extreme, very hard, and a lot of them at once. It's more than we usually experience in real life. It's almost like you're getting overwhelmed with the amount of signaling information that is coming in, and it's very urgent. So this is emotional part. Logical part that is happening in the middle of trauma. And from my understanding, that part of our brain doesn't really care about our happiness. It only cares about our survival. It is extremely, extremely useful part of our brain. People call it reptilian brain. People call it this part of brain ego. As I said, not a therapist, not a psychologist here, so I'm going to call it just a logical part of our brain. That part of our brain at this point doesn't really care about much, but getting Lilith through this bad day and getting her out of this dangerous situation to assure her physical survival. So because of this part of the brain, it just thinking very coldly, what are we supposed to do to avoid it? Like what we're supposed to do to survive. So there are two things that are happening at the same time. And the third thing that is happening is how these two parts interact. I think this is where we're starting to get into how trauma is processed and how our own brain tries to work with itself to get ourselves sorted out. So at this point, Lilith is getting crazy strong emotions, and there's a logical part of our brain that basically says, okay, get it, but we don't have time to process it, to listen to it. I hear you really bad, but now we have to turn it off. So a lot of emotions just getting dismissed. Basically, we will freak out and do other things later, and the brain just focuses about how to get Lilith out of the situation. She might run into the woods, then hide somewhere, then spend the whole night into the woods, running, trying to figure out where to go. And that's really the only focus there. There is a lot of emotions that are happening, but they're being suppressed. Suppressed meaning they're not conscious. At this point, she's not feeling the pain, the fear, all these emotions. And the whole focus of her mind is focused on running, surviving, getting out of the situation. Because if she starts focusing on the fear and everything, she will be distracted. She will not be able to survive. So survival first, everything else after. So this is how I see two ingredients of our psyche happening at the same time, emotional and logical. And this is what's happening at the actual moment of trauma. So now let's talk about what happens right after the initial trauma, which in your case, your character Lilith survived. Because if the character didn't survive, like there is no psychological trauma really. That's it. It's just the ending. So assuming the character survives, so what's the next step after initial trauma? After initial trauma occurs, there is next block where our brain now has learned information. Our logical brain, again, doesn't care about our happiness, really. It only cares about our survival. So, and we learn quite a lot about our survivals. Oh, we jumped from this rock and we twisted our leg. Well, maybe next time I'm not gonna be jumping from this rock. Or for example, last time I touched this glowing thing, it was very painful and I got burned. So next time you already have this understanding that you shouldn't be touching these burning things or whatever, like, I don't know, lighter or whatever. Our brain learns about dangers all the time and it collects this information to inform us later what to do and not to do. And sometimes it works appropriately and sometimes it doesn't work appropriately. For example, like it does with my dog. I remember when she was a puppy, she was jumping really high because she was going crazy and then she landed really funny on her leg. She didn't traumatize herself, but I think she experienced some pain. She screamed and now she's scared of heights of any type. So I guess her brain overlearned this. So now when I have to lift her to carry her somewhere, she's freaking out. Now, even if I touch her a little bit to lift her, she's like all shivering. She did it to herself. So anyway, for example, our brain learns this. Like we learn things that can make us feel pain, we learn things that can be dangerous, learn about things that are just unpleasant. We keep learning this. And trauma is also an extreme learning experience. Now the brain learns, whoa, that can get us killed. So how do we avoid this next time? And this is where it gets a little tricky because we, a lot of the time, cannot comprehend why things happen. Sometimes, especially with traumas that happen early in childhood, which is a lot of them, that's kind of the reason why I believe a lot of traumas usually lead to childhood. We didn't have enough comprehension of the world to understand why certain things happen to us. So we try to figure out how we can possibly protect ourselves from this thing happening again, but we don't quite understand why they happened in the first place. So our brain tries in panic to figure out how to explain what happened and what actions to take to stay safe again. Because for our brain, being in this state of, danger and not knowing how we can protect ourselves is extremely stressful. So our brain has to figure out something. So this is where our logical brain can create a story. And I know in a lot of plot structures or how to write advice, there is a lot of information of what character learned about themselves or the world that it's not true, that they need to eventually overcome. This is the part where the character learns something, that they concoct the story for themselves. And the reason why they concoct the story, I think I'm not a big reader of all these plotting books, but I'm not sure that they implement this element is where the story is created to keep us alive. And this story is not accurate and it's not necessarily correct, but this is the best story that the mind could have come up with to feel safe, to feel like they know how to prepare to avoid the same danger next time. Let's, for example, talk about Lilith. Lilith is 7 years old. This happened out of the blue, and her mind is trying to figure out how to explain this, how to understand why that happened, and how to avoid this happening next time. So her brain, and this is really where it starts getting personal towards your character. We'll talk about this later, but this is where we start getting customization, really. And for example, she might decide, well, they couldn't defend themselves. they're minstrels. Minstrels are weak, and people who are with swords and people who can fight back, these are the ones who stay alive, and these are the ones who stay safe. So she might realize, as long as I'm a minstrel, I will be forever weak and forever in danger of being hurt, murdered, or seeing my loved ones murdered. If I am strong, then is the only way I can stay alive. That could be a story that the character tells themselves. They might realize, who am I? This artist, this minstrel, this singer is bullshit. It doesn't keep me alive. It's dangerous to be this. And I don't want to be this because obviously I want to live. So she might decide, you know what? This career as a minstrel, it's not worth it. In fact, it's the worst one you can have. And I don't want to be a minstrel anymore. I don't want to sing songs because it's pathetic. Only weaklings do that. And I'm not that. I'm different. And I want to learn how to become a swordsman, a fighter. And this is where it's that altering the trajectory of character's life. And this is where, for example, our Lilith might decide, no, I'm not going to be minstrel anymore. I actually going to adjust the way I see the world, and I will learn different skills and will navigate the world different. I will keep in mind that people who are fighters are the ones who are going to survive, or the ones who have a chance to protect their loved ones. And everybody else, it's just useless. It's not worth my time. So this is where the logic starts telling you the story. It can be a lot of different options. She might think it was dark. Never be out in the dark. It can be just as easy like this. Like in the dark, we cannot see danger, we cannot protect themselves, blah, blah, blah. Or we were target. We were in this flashy, colorful caravan, so as long as I don't stand out, I'm safe. There can be a lot of different stories, but let's stick with the one that the character decides to become a swordsman or a fighter, because I'm gonna give you like a bigger picture example at the end. So this is the story that your brain tells yourself. Also, before, like, there is this limbo period from the character understanding, kind of creating this story about how to stay alive, what was the real danger, how to prevent the danger next time. There's a moment of limbo where the character is still not feeling safe. I guess the character might start feeling more safe, or more like they have things under control, as, for example, she starts getting a little stronger in fighting, or she, for example, steals her first sword. Like, she's running through this forest and she arrives to this village and she steals a sword. Now she's like, okay, I feel a little safer with this sword. And between this limbo, there is still a moment where a lot of emotions could be suppressed, because again, we're still in a little bit of a survival mode. We really don't have time to process all our emotions and understand them. So all of that is still getting shoved. And the more times goes, and the more times go forward, the less the character is aware of these emotions. Of course, character can go through some emotions, but a lot of them, they're super big and super difficult to process, might just be under the character's radar. They're in something that psychologists would call subconscious, which is the part of our brain that we're not quite aware of. We don't know what is our subconscious mind. It affects us. We still make decisions and do certain things because of things in our subconscious, but we're not aware. That's why a lot of sayings going around of, when the person themselves don't understand what they're doing, but the person they're talking to understands it clearly and try to communicate it back to you, and, they're not able to comprehend. If you're telling your friend for the 10th time that they should stop dating this type of guy because they're clearly dating this type of guy because so-and-so, and they're just not able to see it, like, not possible. And this is exactly that. Things that are in our subconscious affect us, but we are not aware of this. They're really our blind spot. So this is where a lot of emotions could be shoved in because there is just not time. So this is the timeline, kind of like right after the trauma. We're trying to restructure our world to continue surviving in this world with this new information. And remember, again, our logical mind doesn't care about happiness, it just cares about our survival. That's why that's one of the parts that is so exciting to me and interesting of how we are animals. Really, we just think about survival, but we also have these needs as humans to be happy, and it kind of all clashes a little bit. So now let's talk about the long timeline, like what happens to the character afterwards. Like, the character lives with this, because this is where emotions will come back. And we'll talk a little bit about triggers. And again, I'm apprehensive that I'm talking about pretty complicated topic, and Every person on this planet is in some degree affected by a certain traumatic experience, big or small, just like our characters. So I want to talk about this a little bit careful. So also understand I'm also a human. This is just my understanding and how I see triggers. But let's talk about them and kind of what they are and how you can work with them in your story. How I see triggers is that when you're finally feeling that you are safe, your brain will start slowly bringing back your emotions back, because emotions are important. They had important information, they told you some important things, and they are stuck at the moment. The emotions of certain events were not processed. They were past and suppressed, and a lot of the time people who haven't processed certain emotions, they feel extremely uncomfortable encountering similar emotions in themselves in certain situations or in others. For example, if they were never able to process their anger for whatever reason, it was not safe to process their anger, they will not be able to recognize when they feel anger next time, and they will be blind to their own anger, and the situation that causes them anger will be the situation they want to get out immediately, instead of actually understand why they're feeling anger, get the information, and adjust their behavior within the situation. Instead, they just want to get away. And this is actually a very personal example, which is really funny. I've been working with a therapist for a year, and I realized that I don't feel anger. I had to actually learn how to feel my own anger. I thought, I'm never angry. What are you talking about? What happens is that I get upset or I get sad. I never get angry. And only working with a therapist, I realized that I actually have a lot of anger in me. And the reason being because in my childhood, anger, it was not proper to express anger towards your parents. Like, it was just not just my family, just socially was not right in the environment that I was growing up. It's basically that the child cannot be angry back at their parents. But emotions, we cannot control them. It's like pain. It's feelings and signals that appear to just tell us about something. We really cannot control them. We need to just process them. And when you're told to control emotions or don't have an emotions, it doesn't work. It just gets suppressed if you feel that you have to suppress it to still be accepted in the society that you're in. There's a lot of ways and a lot of reasons why we might choose to suppress our emotions, but this is actually my example. And to me, it was extremely interesting because when I was just learning to understand that I feel anger, I actually would use a mirror or the camera on my phone, anything. I would feel certain discomfort, let's say, in certain situations. Certain situation would make me feel uncomfortable, and my brain will immediately say, oh, the situation is just not right. Something is wrong with these guys. La, 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 la. Get yourself out there. Something is wrong, whatever. And then I would look at the camera at my own face, and I will see that my face is angry, and I'm like, oh, so this discomfort that I feel is actually anger. And slowly I started to realize, oh, I'm angry. And then I'm able to say, oh, why? Like, what is so angry about this? After hearing to my emotions, I could understand the messages and the information that I was getting from myself. So it is the same-ish thing with triggers, except triggers, obviously, if we're talking about trauma, they lead to very, very, very difficult emotions. And at this point, these emotions would be out of the context. Remember, these are emotions from a traumatic event, like murder of your whole menstrual family, let's say. And I'm actually wondering, am I going to get in trouble with YouTube by saying murder like 25 times in this video? Let's see. These are emotions from that situations, and they were suppressed. And now, eventually, our brain, when we actually feel safe, like we know that we're not, at some level, our brain understands that we're not in the same dangerous situation, our brain tries to bring these emotions back for us to finally kind of clean them out of our subconscious, finally feel them through, so they don't affect us without us knowing. But emotions that are coming up are so strong and so out of context, and a lot of the time you don't understand when they're coming up. That's why they're called triggers. They're sudden, they are huge and very massive, like things that are coming up. And a lot of the times we really don't know why. And there's a whole concept of how memory is being stored from the traumatic event. And this one I'm not going to get into because, again, I'm not a healthcare professional. And this is where I feel like it's not applicable to writing. But I want to just mention there is something very interesting if you want to explore. That's extremely interesting. There is a way of how our memory can be stored fragmented in our memory, kind of like so we cannot find it. Like for our own survival, our brain just hides the memory. So the concept of triggers can be extremely, extremely interesting of how things can trigger us because they're just fragment of this memory. That's why sometimes we don't even know why we got triggered. And sometimes we have extreme reactions and we don't understand why. It can be just due to smell or certain words and something like this. And I experienced this myself. I had 2 panic attacks in my life, and proper panic attacks where I feel there is a little bit miscommunication and misconception online, but the one I had, I thought I'm going to die. I thought I'm having a stroke. It was extremely physical reaction. I thought I'm having a physical problem. And it happened out of nowhere. I had no idea. It was out of nowhere. One second, I was sitting in my university class doing academic drawing. And the next one, I thought I'm going to pass out, puke, and just hallucinate and have a seizure all at the same time. And I didn't know what the hell was going on. And nobody was able to help me because they also didn't know what was going on. And only later I understood that it was a panic attack. And I had one later on in life that also I couldn't understand what's wrong. And in retrospective, I was able to. So a lot of the times, and just disclaimer, I didn't experience a major life-altering trauma in my life. So it just goes to show that our psyche is so gentle. You really don't need to be a minstrel in a fantasy story to experience something traumatic to your mental health. And I definitely didn't experience something this traumatic in my life. And still, my brain was so sensitive, and it decided that it's going to be affected by something that happened in my childhood. A couple of things. Again, nothing traumatic. I was murdered. I wasn't abused. It doesn't have to be that. Trauma is interesting like this and very individual. That's kind of what triggers are. These are the moment in time. They're spaced out like a pretty certain time away from your trauma. And there are, of course, situations, let's say our character in this moment after trauma, her brain would literally just push away on anything that reminds her of the emotions. Like she has to survive, they will push away. But the ones that I'm talking about is later, as something comes up and all of a sudden it makes you experience a lot, this rush of emotions that was suppressed before. So this is something that character will experience. And in a lot of creative media and a lot of stories and a lot of movies, a TV show, this is presented to us as flashbacks. And I think this is an excellent way of using flashbacks because in a lot of ways, this is how triggers are. It's like you experience a flashback of the past. Sometimes you don't understand it completely. And a lot of the times you don't understand it completely. But again, it's like a flush. It's very out of nowhere, overwhelming. You can't really control it. It just happens. So I think that's actually a pretty cool way to use it. And we're going to talk about this a little bit in examples. Now the character is living their life in a certain way that might not necessarily represent their true purpose. And we're going to talk about this later in the video, but they're living a certain life because in the past, they didn't understand how they found themselves in this very dangerous situation. So their mind came up with the idea of why, and then they were able to find a solution. So let's go back to our minstrel. Now she's living her life as this warrior, and she's defending maybe other people, but most of all, she's very feisty. She's ready to fight. She's ready to defend her life at any point. And now she's more or less in safety. So from time to time, she's having these triggers, kind of like flashbacks, when she's having some memories laced with emotions coming back. And the reason is to just be processed. They just want to be heard. Her own psyche wants to finally being able to feel these emotions, to process these emotions. But because they're so strong, they're so scary. And especially if they're from traumatic event, they're associated with danger to her life, and they might be suppressed again. Like the mind can come in and start trying to suppress them, so it becomes a little bit of a mess. At this point you need a therapist, but obviously it's a fantasy. Your fantasy might not have therapy yet. So this is what the character is experiencing at this point. Now this is kind of like the overall structure how I'm seeing it. And this is where you can play a lot with customization again, like what the character decides to do, what path they're going to choose, and how these triggers, flashbacks are coming in, what triggers them, like what are the triggers. Because in this way, you can tell interesting story about the character's past. So you see how a lot of events are kind of lining up here. As you can see, it is already an interesting setup for cool writing. So now let's talk about how I like to implement this into my character's journey. And again, this is completely made up system by me that I'm using myself, and sometimes I'm using it badly and sometimes I'm using it well. But this is the system that I'm using for myself to kind of integrate traumatic experience into the character. And this is, again, when I need to mention that trauma doesn't have to be major, insane, it can be something minor. This system still works, because what trauma really needs to be is some event that altered the character's behavior to keep them safe at some point. It can be still minor, something really minor, because we as social species do need feeling of being accepted by community to feel safe. That's why a lot of behaviors that made us feel shame are always becoming some sort of a trauma. A lot of events that made us not accepted in our school or in kindergarten, I don't know, make us feel that we need to change something about our personality or change something about how we live our life to be safe, because being outcast in the society is dangerous for us as species. Again, trauma doesn't have to be big, it can be small, but this logic works. So how I like to envision my character, I like to call it 4 points of the character journey. And this is a little interesting. I actually like this very much. I never talked about this, but this is how it works in my head. So first, I would like to imagine a straight line from A to B. So we have 2 points, A and B. The point A is who the character was right before the point where the trauma happened. And this is who they are, their essence, who they are as a person, what they're interested in, what they want from life, like truly who they are as a person at this point, A. And for Lilith, because she was growing up with minstrels and naturally who she was an artist, she was a singer, she had this beautiful voice and she would have so much talent, and she was also very, very passionate about it. She would train all the time, she would sing all the time, she would come up with this beautiful, inspiring, beautiful songs, and this is who she was. So then think about the point B. And the point B is who this character, like their kind of ultimate version, who they're supposed to become in the story and their role in the story, which is also a natural progression of who they are. Imagine this point is Lilith is becoming this absolutely famous, inspiring singer that is in the castle working with the queen and king that discovered her, and she's singing these beautiful haunting songs that help soldiers on the battlefield to inspire them to go into the battle and win the wars. And her songs are literally something that helps to change the trajectory of this kingdom and to help them survive, let's say, some moment of unrest. Maybe her songs even help unite the nation and help to do a lot of cool, amazing things. Let's say this is like the ultimate part, the point B. Now, let's place point C, and point C is the trauma. So what this trauma does, we already discussed it, it kind of shifts, like this line that we had between A and B, point C is, let's say, right here. And it shifts the character trajectory, making it go off the rails from the track that was leading to point B. So now the character is in point C right here after the trauma. And the thing is, I always like to imagine there is this invisible pull, the character always being pulled to go to point B. But what they truly want, by all the foreshadowing the story, by all the feelings that they have, you can feel like this is their perfect place. So point B, spoiler alert, it's never gonna happen. But we need to feel like this is the point that is the most logical for this character. This has to be like it, because it doesn't appear, at least in my system, your reader should feel it, like they almost can imagine it. And this is where, when I got bring example of Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, because I think it's a great example. The reason why we really want the character to find their way back to like the good side and to help Team Avatar and all this thing, because we feel like this is actually who he's supposed to become. He's supposed to become this good guy. He's supposed to be the one who goes against his own family and stands up. We feel it. That's why we really want the character to go there, because we feel this point. I think if you can make the point B feasible and make it so the reader feels this point, you can really create this pull so the reader knows where the character has to go. The reader cheers for the character. They want the character to go there. It's so satisfying for the reader when the character makes the right move, and it's so devastating when they don't. But because they're already derailed, because of their trauma, they're off their path. So they're trying to find it. And it's not, this is where you can get creative. It can be this, but it's probably boring, but you can go more interesting in different lines. You can make their journey more interesting, that they're going closer to point B, but they're not quite grasping point B. But then, for example, they go backwards a little bit. And this is where, in context of their own trauma, is where, for example, Lilith, she could be going through this market and she hears this woman sings and she feels this urge to sing, like this is a little step there. Or, for example, then next day she finds this girl with a cut throat because somebody attacked her, and she's like, nope, never mind, that's bullshit, like I cannot, going back, I'm never gonna sing again, blah blah blah. And eventually, let's say, slowly, certain events, certain choices that the character makes, it's kind of should be, I think, a good combination between events that happen to the character and character choices. So it's more interesting to see the world that character interacts with, that the world affects us, but also it should be character choices involved so that the character is not just floating as a leaf on the wind. This is where the character slowly finding their footing and slowly going to point B. That this is the kicker. They're never arriving to point B. Point B got erased during the trauma. There is another point that is called point D. And this is the point that is very close to point B, but it's not quite that. So let's say, example of Lilith. Let's say she is living her life as a swordsman, as a warrior, and songs are calling her. And maybe she would write one on another, or maybe one time she would sing a song to a dying brother in arms just to give him some comfort in his dying moments. Maybe it shows and it appears from time to time. And now, eventually, she starts to become this inspiring singer that she always wanted to be, but she is not in the same place. Something is slightly different. So maybe, and this is a maybe, this is where you can go crazy with writing, and this is where I go crazy in writing. Now, her role is, for example, she ends up as this talented singer who sings these haunting, beautiful songs that inspire the whole nation, but she sings them as a soldier in the army now. And now all her songs inspire the soldiers right there with her on the battlefield and make her, her unit or whatever perform so well. And her unit is the decisive one in the war. And from there, you can go tragic, you can go happy ending, you can go whatever you want. But the story of the character, the arc of the character is complete. So your reader would feel satisfaction where they arrive close to this point. And this is where an interesting part where you can play with. This is kind of has to do with the theme of your story. What is thematically are you trying to say, depending how front and center your character's internal journey is in your story. Depending on how your character arrives and where exactly your character arrives, this is what you tell. So I think point D and B should be not exactly the same, but they should be close to each other, but not way too much apart. Because if you communicate to your reader kind of like, oh, the character was on the track there, but then this terrible things happen, and then they still found their way there, the exactly same spot. I think that's not satisfying. It almost feels like the tragedy happens for the sake of tragedy. And there was no meaning to this tragedy. There was nothing at all that came out of this tragedy except suffering. And I think the message like this, exactly just like that, can be a little frustrating and difficult for a lot of readers. And it, again, up to you. You can write the stories exactly the way you want, depending on what you want to say. Maybe this is exactly the two message you're going to say, that tragedies are they just happen and there's nothing you can do. Maybe. I like to avoid this because I feel like stories are supposed to help us go through life. They're supposed to help us understand our path and the concept of living. And I feel, my personal opinion here, that in life, things matter. Like, there is nothing that just happens because it was terrible and there's nothing you got from there. Like, there's no value that you can still grab from here. Like, it just happens just for the suffering's sake. I don't feel like the life is like this. Maybe I'm Delulu, but I mean, I believe tragedies do happen and it's terrible. But I feel like there's some grains that you can get out of there. Again, it's your prerogative, but I like to make sure point D and B are not the same, but I also don't like them to be too far apart. Because if, let's say, her role, let's say B, was just to be a minstrel in this caravan, and she was supposed to like live and die in this caravan, and her life would be unremarkable. But then because of this trauma that happened to her, she became this great warrior that ever lived. Like, you see, like at this point, it's just, whoa, it's too much. I think it could be a little insensitive for your reader. Your reader might have problems accepting this if you're not presenting it very carefully, that the trauma is the sole reason or the major reason why the character succeeded in life. And this depends on the trauma. Let's say if the trauma was, I don't know, something happened in school and they got bullied, whatever, sure. But if it's like something extremely traumatic, like it always in our fantasy stories, then it could be difficult for the reader to accept, because your reader, if they put themselves in character's shoes, and the character themselves probably would always choose to have their loved ones not die just for them to be there. They probably, if they're there, achieved whatever they wanted. They will still be like, you know what? If I could cancel that to not be here, I would not be here. It's fine. Please bring me here. So I think we always would choose for trauma not to happen. So I think if you space the points B and D too far apart, it becomes unsatisfying for the reader. Like the reader doesn't want to be on that journey. Like this is kind of the idea of what you're saying. This is a theme. You always say something in your story. Your story is always some sort of a thesis, and your character is argument. Your character and their actions and their story is an argument for your thesis, and the characters that your character meet alongside their journey can be also argument for or against. It almost unconscious. This is what we're doing. Like the stories kind of fall into the structure whether we want it or not. That's why a lot of themes, we don't have as much of a control of a theme as of a plot. It just slowly arise from the story, for all these choices, from these small tweaks of why this happened instead of that, or why this was caused by that. This is slowly like a philosophy of our world emerges. And I think with trauma, you have to be very careful and keep your eyes on the theme, because if the trauma is front and center of your story, it will affect the theme. Like it will swing your theme one way or the other. So it's important to keep your attention there. So this is something that I wanted to touch upon, of how you move this journey and how the ending of the character interacts. But again, this is just my structure, the ones I use for my characters. So if it works for you, please use it. If it doesn't, and never mind. I hope it was entertaining. But this is just my way of writing the characters, and this is just my way to, this 4-point structure of character's journey is just my invention. But this is how I like structuring it, to understand how you can implement trauma in your character arc overall. And you can add a lot on top, and this is where you can do a lot of customization. I hope Lilith was a great example. She's kind of compelling. I kind of want to write a story about her right now, but I'm busy. I hope that at least help how I approach writing trauma, and how I try to still be respectful to the concept of trauma and still implement it into a character journey, because if it's a big trauma, it will affect your character big time. So this is kind of my logic. And with that said, it kind of concludes this video. I would like to still talk a little bit about how to draw trauma, but I don't want to muddle the waters in this video, because that could be a shorter video. I wanted to create this base. So I hope this was interesting to you. I hope you found something helpful in this video. If you did, again, I would really appreciate if you leave a comment, give it a like, or subscribe to this channel. Things can happen, but overall likes and comments really help the videos. I learned it the hard way when my videos didn't perform that well, but if it was valuable to you, I would appreciate you showing the support with your like and the comment. But other than this, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a good day, and I see you in my next one. Thank you, guys.